The police station was a hive of activity. The incessant buzz of ringing phones, the clatter of keyboards, and the murmur of voices creating a palpable tension in the air. Harry was at his desk, engrossed in a report, as he assisted Daniels in reconstructing the events of the robbery. The case was far from simple. The robbers had vanished without a trace, leaving the officers in a state of disarray, each with their own theories. "Okay, let's go over this again," Daniels said, his brow furrowed as he stared at the half-finished report on the screen. "We pursued the suspects down the alley, and then they just disappeared." Harry nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He had repeatedly replayed the scene in his head, trying to find some non-magical explanation that would satisfy his colleagues. But the truth was undeniable. Magic was involved, and it was getting harder to keep up the charade. "Yeah," Harry replied, his voice flat. "One minute they were there, and the next, gone. No signs of struggle, no hidden exits. Just gone." Daniels rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. "It's like a scene from a fairy tale. Half the station thinks we're chasing shadows, and the other half, well, they're convinced those wizards are real." His voice carried the weight of the situation, the disbelief in the room almost tangible. Harry's grip on his pen tightened. The arguments had been escalating ever since the first strange incidents began. The station was divided. Some officers dismissed the idea of magic as nonsense, while others started to believe there might be something more to these unexplained events. The tension was palpable, and Harry could feel it weighing on him more with each passing day. "We just need to stick to the facts," Harry said, trying to sound convincing, even though he knew the facts wouldn't get them far. "No point in speculating about things we can't prove." Daniels sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, you're right. But it's hard to ignore when every case lately seems to have something strange about it." Harry forced a smile, but inside, he felt like he was being torn apart. The dual life he led, balancing the reality of magic with the world of the Muggles, was becoming an increasingly heavy burden to bear. He could feel the cracks starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before something gave way. As Daniels continued typing the report, Harry found it harder and harder to focus. The station noise grew louder, and the voices overlapped, grating on his nerves. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating, and Harry could feel his composure slipping. "I'm going to step out for a minute," he said abruptly, pushing his chair back and standing up. "Need some fresh air." Daniels looked up, surprised. "You all right, mate?" "Yeah, just need a break. I'll be back in a bit." Harry grabbed his coat and headed for the exit without waiting for a response. The cool air outside hit him like a wave as he stepped onto the street. He took a deep breath in an attempt to steady himself. He walked a few paces away from the entrance, trying to clear his head. The city buzzed around him, the sounds of traffic and distant conversations filling the air, but it all felt like a distant hum compared to the storm brewing inside him. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as he tried to gather his thoughts. The walls were closing in, both at work and at home. The arguments at the station, the secrecy he was forced to maintain, and the pressure of trying to keep Andrew in the dark were all becoming too much. He had always known that living between two worlds wouldn't be easy, but lately it felt like he was losing his grip on both. Harry exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chilly air. He needed to pull himself together, but the weight of everything was pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe and think. He opened his eyes and looked up at the sky, wishing for some kind of sign, some guidance on what to do next. But there was nothing, just the cold, grey expanse above, as indifferent as ever. The only thing he knew was that he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change, or he'd lose everything he'd worked so hard to protect. But what would that change be? He still had no idea. They arrived at the Simmons house, a modest brick home in a quiet Muggle neighbourhood of London, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But as they approached, the dread that hung in the air was palpable, a sensation Harry couldn't shake, even though he'd experienced far worse in his past life as a wizard. Mrs. Simmons met them at the door, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her hands shaking as she clutched the doorframe. Harry could see the fear etched deep in her face, the kind that no amount of comforting words could easily erase. "Police officers, please, come in," she stammered, stepping aside to let them in. Her voice trembled, and Harry could feel the raw desperation behind it. Inside, the house was neat, but felt eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Harry followed Mrs. Simmons into the living room, where she motioned for them to sit. She sank into a chair across from them, wringing her hands together. "Tell us everything you can remember," Daniels began, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Simmons took a shaky breath. "Last night everything was normal. I put Emily to bed around 8:30, just like always. This morning, when I went to wake her, she wasn't there. Her bed was empty, and the window was open." Harry exchanged a quick glance with Daniels. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to this? Strangers in the area? Any odd behaviour from Emily?" Mrs. Simmons shook her head, her face crumpling. "No, nothing like that. We live in such a safe neighbourhood. I never imagined something like this could happen here." Harry nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. "We'd like to see Emily's room if that's all right." Mrs. Simmons led them down a short hallway to a small bedroom at the end. Harry stepped inside, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. The room was decorated with bright colours, stuffed animals lined up on a shelf, and a small bed in the centre, its covers still rumpled from the night before. Daniels moved to the window, examining it closely. "No signs of forced entry," he murmured. "But it's unlocked." Harry's eyes roved over the room, searching for anything out of place. He crouched down by the bed, his fingers brushing against the floor. Nothing. "Mrs. Simmons, was anything disturbed? Anything missing from her room?" Harry asked, standing up. Mrs. Simmons shook her head again. "No, everything's as it was, except for her." Harry's heart ached at the anguish in her voice, but he forced himself to stay focused. There was more to this than met the eye. There always was. As they continued their investigation, Harry couldn't help but feel that familiar sense of something strange, something magical, lingering just out of reach. But for now, he pushed that thought aside. They had a girl to find. The investigation dragged on, but after half an hour of combing through the area, they came up empty. The street was eerily quiet, with no sign of the missing girl or any clues that might explain her sudden disappearance. Harry and Daniel's frustration was palpable as they reconvened near the patrol car. Daniels let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "This doesn't make any sense, Harry. There's nothing here. No footprints, broken branches, or witnesses. It's like she just vanished into thin air." Harry's expression was grim as he scanned the street one last time, hoping to catch anything to help them solve this mystery. But deep down, he knew they were at a dead end. The traces of magic he'd sensed earlier were faint and elusive, slipping away like smoke on the wind. "I know," Harry muttered, trying to control his frustration, "but we can't stop looking. She has to be somewhere." Daniels leaned against the patrol car, his skepticism giving way to something else, a creeping sense of disbelief growing stronger with each strange case they encountered. He looked at Harry, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Look, Harry, I'm not one to believe in fairy tales or ghost stories," Daniels began, hesitating as he chose his words carefully. But between those robbers disappearing and now this, I don't know, man. It's getting harder to deny that something beyond our understanding might be at play here. Harry felt a jolt of anxiety. Daniels was getting closer to the truth, and it wouldn't be long before others started asking the same questions. The thought of his colleagues, and especially Andrew, discovering the existence of magic filled him with dread. He had to deflect, to steer the conversation away from dangerous territory. I get it, Harry said, forcing a casual tone. But let's not jump to conclusions. There's always an explanation, even if we can't see it immediately. Daniels didn't look convinced, but a familiar voice called out from behind them before he could press the issue further. Harry! Harry turned around to see Andrew approaching, concern etched on his face. He was still in his work clothes, his brow furrowed as he looked from Harry to Daniels, and then back again. Andrew, Harry said, surprised to see him here. What are you doing here? I was nearby, Andrew replied, glancing at the scene with curiosity and worry. I saw the police cars and thought I'd check to see if you were okay. What's going on? Harry hesitated, his mind racing to come up with a plausible explanation. He could feel Daniel's eyes on him, waiting to see how he would handle this unexpected interruption. The last thing Harry needed was for Andrew to start asking questions he couldn't answer. There's been a kidnapping, Harry said, choosing his words carefully. A young girl disappeared from her room, and we're trying to figure out what happened. It's complicated. Andrew's concern deepened, and he looked at Harry more closely. Complicated how? Is there something you're not telling me? Harry opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of everything he kept from Andrew made it hard to find the right words. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he protect Andrew from the truth that was slowly unravelling around them? Before Harry could formulate a reply, Daniels stepped in, sensing the awkwardness of the situation. It's just a tough case, he said, trying to ease the tension. No tangible clues, nothing to go on. She just disappeared, just like the robbers did. Andrew's eyes widened in surprise. Disappeared? Like, just gone? Daniels nodded, his expression serious. Yeah, it's baffling, to say the least. Andrew didn't seem entirely reassured, but he nodded slowly. Okay, if you say so. Just be careful, all right? Harry managed a small smile. I will. Don't worry. As Andrew lingered for a moment longer, Harry felt the strain of the secret life he was leading pulling at him more than ever. Andrew had no idea what was happening, and Harry wasn't sure how long he could keep it that way. After a brief, tense silence, Andrew finally said, I'll let you get back to work. I'll see you later. Yeah, Harry replied, his voice softer now. I'll be home as soon as I can. Andrew gave him a lingering look, then nodded to Daniels before walking away, his steps slow and hesitant. Once Andrew was out of earshot, Daniels turned to Harry, raising an eyebrow. Your boyfriend, I assume? Harry nodded, suddenly feeling very tired. Yeah. Daniels seemed to consider something for a moment, then said, He's worried about you. Can't blame him, considering what we've been dealing with. Harry didn't respond, his mind drifting back to the case and the growing list of things he couldn't tell Andrew. The secrecy, the lies. It was all becoming too much. But he had no choice until he found a way to resolve this mess. Let's finish up here, Harry said quietly, pushing his feelings aside for the moment. We've got a missing girl to find. As they resumed their work, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiralling out of control. And with each new incident, the line between his two worlds grew thinner, threatening to shatter altogether.